Where did the neocons come from? Trotskyism and CIA irrationalism. And we are going to talk about the roots of neoconservatism and the ideology that kind of defines U.S. foreign policy at this point. The people running U.S. foreign policy in both the Democrat and Republican Party are Russia-hating fanatics, and they are from a school of thought called neoconservatism. Marco Rubio is trained by neoconservatives. John Bolton is trained by neoconservatives. The Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol, his father, Irving Kristol, was considered the founder of neoconservatism. So where did neoconservative thought come from? What is neoconservatism? That's going to be the slideshow for tonight. So we're going to start out by talking about the 1930s. 1930s America was a very, very, very different political atmosphere. And New York City in particular had a very unique political atmosphere during these years. The 1930s, America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt was the president, and Roosevelt was a Bonapartist. The ruling class were fighting among themselves. There were labor uprisings going on all throughout the country. People were literally starving on the streets. Roosevelt was the president. Strikes and protests and labor union struggles were happening constantly. And there were many people in the government, in the military, who wanted to remove Roosevelt and replace him with a fascist dictatorship. And so because of that, Roosevelt was forced to make an alliance with anti-fascists. And that included the communists, were a big part of the Roosevelt coalition against fascism. And because Roosevelt was there was the business plot in 1933. It was a conspiracy that was revealed in congressional testimony to remove Roosevelt from office. Because Hitler was in power in Germany, Italy had Mussolini as the dictator, the economy was getting worse, and there was a lot of instability. Roosevelt did everything he could to make himself popular and align himself with labor unions. And so there was kind of a mass movement at the time, a labor movement, and that labor movement and other kind of progressive leftist movements of the day united behind Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the president, and Roosevelt was facing off against fascism, and there was kind of a mass movement of people who supported Roosevelt. This is a little bit of a video about the anti-fascist Popular Front. This will just kind of show you the political atmosphere of the time.
Rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Oh, we're springing to the call for 300,000 more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll fill the vacant ranks of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will welcome to our number the loyal, true and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although he may be poor, he shall never be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll hurl the rebel crew from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. With the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Yeah, so that was the 1930s. And in New York City, which is a very cosmopolitan city, you have people from all over the world who come to New York City. There have been huge waves of immigration from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, from Italy, a very large African-American population, a very large Puerto Rican population. New York City, one of the most diverse parts of the United States. It was the headquarters. It was the Communist Party USA was at the height of its power. In the early 1930s, the Communist Party had moved its headquarters to Chicago, but in the late 1930s, 1936, they had moved their headquarters back to New York City. And New York City was really the concentration of their power. Roosevelt was the president, and the Communist Party supported Roosevelt on the basis of Roosevelt being an anti-fascist. And Roosevelt did a lot of things that helped working people, right? He hired millions of unemployed people. There was mass unemployment during the Great Depression. So Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration and hired millions of unemployed workers and gave them a job building bridges and highways, etc. And Roosevelt did a lot of things that were, you could say, illiberal. For example, in addition to hiring people to build bridges, he started something called the National Theater Project. And the National Theater Project went around putting on plays that were, very low cost, and it was government-sponsored theater. Well, the National Theater Project didn't just put on plays, it put on leftist propaganda. They did a play for school children called Revolt of the Beavers. You can look it up, Revolt of the Beavers. And it's very much a socialist play about, there's one greedy capitalist beaver who's exploiting and oppressing the poor beavers. And so the poor beavers rise up and overthrow the greedy capitalist beaver. Another play they put on was called It Can't Happen Here. And it was all about the USA becoming fascist and how it could happen here. And there could be a fascist dictatorship in America. And Roosevelt was using the National Theater Project to spread propaganda to support himself. And he hired millions of unemployed workers. He won the 1936 election. He was reelected in a landslide. But it was one of the first times, one of the only times in American history that, that he didn't, the majority of the rich people were against him. And Roosevelt very famously gave a speech in Madison Square Garden. He said, "Never before have they been so united in their hatred of any candidate, and I welcome their hatred." And he talked about economic royalists, and we need a government that will roll up its sleeves. We're tired of do nothing, hear nothing, see nothing government. And that Roosevelt was a Bonapartist. And he was trying to hold on to power by building a mass movement, and he had this alliance with the Communist Party. Now, it was complicated for a couple reasons. One, the Democratic Party, which Roosevelt was the leader of, was also the party of Jim Crow segregation, right? The Republicans had been the party of Lincoln, and the South, the so-called Solid South, they called it, was Jim Crow. It was a place where black people couldn't vote, black people couldn't drink out of drinking fountains, lynching was routine, and so it was a complicated situation. The Communist Party of the United States, they were heavily involved in the labor unions. Now, the main labor federation that existed in these times was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. But the AFL was notoriously racist. Many AFL unions had whites-only clauses. And the AFL had a ban on communist members. And the AFL often refused to unionize what they called industrial workers. They would only organize, quote unquote, skilled workers, right? If your job didn't have an apprenticeship, if it was just a job on an assembly line, like an auto worker or a meat packer, it was a job that didn't require a large amount of training, they wouldn't unionize you because they said you shouldn't have a union. It was only skilled craftsmen. So the Communist Party formed the CIO. And basically what happened was the leader of the miners' union was a member of the AFL, a guy named John L. Lewis. And in 1936, John L. Lewis punched the leader of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. He punched him and he walked out. And the miners' union formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a rival labor union federation to the AFL. And they were for industrial workers, meaning that if you worked as an auto worker, if you worked as a meat packer, if you worked as a steel worker, you could be part of the CIO. They didn't only organize skilled workers; they organized "quote unquote" unskilled workers as well. The CIO had no ban on foreign-born, non-English speaking, or non-white workers. It was multiracial. And on top of that, the CIO had no ban on communists. And thousands of Communist Party members were hired by the CIO to be organizers. And in 1937, the year after Roosevelt was elected president, you had the sit-down strike wave, where workers were occupying their factories to demand union contracts. And all over the country, there were over 400 sit-down strikes. And workers won union contracts by occupying their factory, having like sit-ins in the factory to demand union contracts. And Roosevelt was the president, and he supported them in doing so because he was in a fight against, his own class. Many of the rich people wanted to remove him and set up a fascist dictatorship. So Roosevelt was encouraging the sit-down strikes. So New York City was a stronghold of labor. You had the American Federation of Labor, you had the CIO, and you had the Communist Party based in New York City, that was part of the CIO and was a big organization. The Communist Party controlled 2 city council seats in Harlem. Peter Cascioni was an Italian-American. He was a member of the Communist Party. He had 1 city council seat in Harlem. And the second was Benjamin Davis. And Benjamin Davis was African-American. And he took the seat of Adam Clayton Powell, who was a very famous black leader who was later a member of Congress. Adam Clayton Powell, when he moved on to be in Congress, Adam Clayton Powell's seat was taken by Benjamin Davis, who was a member of the Communist Party. And then on top of that, they had an Italian-American named Vito Marcantonio, who was in the U.S. House of Representatives, who was not a member of the Communist Party, but he was very close to it. The Communist Party in New York City in particular had a lot of power and influence. Now, also, the civil rights movement as we know it, the modern civil rights movement didn't get going until the 1950s. But in Harlem, in New York City, there was a very strong black movement. There were a number of organizations that fought for the rights of African Americans. One of them was the Nation of Islam. So you'd had Marcus Garvey, who was kind of the father of black nationalism. Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica, and Marcus Garvey kind of invented the concept of black nationalism. He had the Back to Africa movement. And he was framed up for mail fraud and thrown in federal prison and then deported from the United States. At his trial, Marcus Garvey said that it was Jews that were responsible. He basically said that the NAACP, which was another organization that fought for African Americans, he said that it was influenced by money from wealthy Jewish donors and that they had stabbed him in the back. And at his trial, Marcus Garvey blamed Jewish people for going to federal prison. After Marcus Garvey was deported back to Jamaica, the Nation of Islam emerged to be the main black nationalist organization. They were a religious group from Detroit, and their leader had been a guy they call Master Farad, who was the leader of it. And it was a religious group in Detroit that based itself on Islam, but also based itself on the Bible and Christianity, and also believed that black people were the original people and had a spiritual belief about black people. The founder of the Nation of Islam, Master Farad, disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. And a guy named Elijah Muhammad became the leader of the Nation of Islam. He was in Detroit. And under Elijah Muhammad's leadership, the Nation of Islam spread mainly through the northern United States, through industrial centers. In particular, it set up shop in Harlem, and it was a very big religious movement in Harlem. Black nationalism was very much rising in Harlem during this period, the Nation of Islam. In addition to that, you had a guy named Father Divine. And Father Divine was an African-American minister born in the South who believed he was the second coming of Jesus. And he set up cooperative businesses that were, employee-owned businesses all over Harlem and Philadelphia. In fact, there's a hotel in Philadelphia that he built, a very large hotel, and that he also was fighting for the liberation of Black people, etc. Now, in this context, you had Ethiopia was a country in Africa that was targeted and invaded by Mussolini. Italy seized and occupied Ethiopia. And the communists of the world, the Soviet Union was the only country in the world to speak up in support of Ethiopia. And the communists organized hands-off Ethiopia rallies. And many Black Americans supported Ethiopia because they saw Mussolini's Italy as like the Ku Klux Klan or like the fascists in America. And they saw Ethiopia as a Black African nation. And so the Communist Party organized hands-off Ethiopia rallies. In addition to that, there was a case called the Scottsboro Nine. There were 9 young African-American men that were charged with rape and were facing the death penalty in the South. I believe it was it in Georgia or Alabama? I don't remember which state. And all they had done was be in the same train car as a white woman. A white woman had been in the train car with them. There was no proof that they'd even had sex with this woman. They were just in the same train car as a white woman, and they were all facing the death penalty for rape. And that became a very important cause. And eventually the Supreme Court did overturn their convictions. The Scottsboro Nine were released from jail. It was a big case that the Communist Party, the International Labor Defenders, were involved in. And I believe the NAACP was somewhat reluctant to get involved, but they also ended up supporting the Scottsboro Nine. And that was a really big case. So in Harlem and New York City, you had the Communist Party controlling seats. You had a Black liberation movement. You had Roosevelt as the president. You had a very strong labor movement. And the Communist Party during these years had maybe 100,000 members, right? To be clear, not being a member of the Communist Party was not something that was open to everybody. You had to give the whole of your life. There were many people that were members of labor unions that were led by communists, members of unemployment councils that were led by communists, members of civil rights and Black freedom organizations that were led by communists that weren't in the party. But in terms of actual membership, the party probably had maybe it had about 100,000 people tops. This is their 1936 convention in Madison Square Garden. And their leader was a guy named Earl Browder.
Events and issues are beginning to stand out so that they can be seen by the masses. You don't have to give long-winded explanations anymore. The people see, the people understand. What they need is a voice to express it for them and an organization to rally them. And the people are going to march forward. With the people will belong the victory.
Yeah, so that was the Communist Party, and they were quite popular and powerful during these years. This is like the height of their influence in America in the late 1930s, and New York City was probably the place where they had the most power. So then there was a breakaway form of communism called Trotskyism, right? The leader of the Soviet Union was Stalin, but Trotsky was a guy who had led the Russian Revolution, who had a falling out with Stalin, had fled the Soviet Union. First, he'd lived in Turkey, and then he had lived in France, and then he moved to Mexico. And Trotsky formed the Fourth International, which was his followers. The Communist International that was led by Stalin was the Third International, so he formed the Fourth International. And Trotsky was a guy who had been the leader of the Red Army, and he had known Lenin and such, but he had had a falling out with Stalin, and he was against the Soviet government. And he said that the Soviet Union's leaders were what he called a parasitical bureaucracy, that they were a counter-revolutionary parasitical bureaucracy. Trotsky maintained that the Soviet Union was a degenerated workers' state, that it was still socialist in its economic foundations, but it was led by a corrupt bureaucracy, and he wanted what he called a political revolution, not an economic revolution. He wanted to keep the economic system, but he wanted to overthrow the bureaucracy and overthrow the Soviet government and bring himself to power. And from exile, he formed the Fourth International. And in America, the Fourth International, they finally they became, they had a number of different names, and for a while they were calling themselves the Communist League, and then they were the U.S. Workers' Party, and then they joined the Socialist Party as a faction, and then they were kicked out of the the Socialist Party. So ultimately, they called themselves the Socialist Workers' Party, or the SWP. And they're still around today, by the way. I mean, there's whatever's left of them. They have the militant newspaper, Pathfinder books. There's not very many of them anymore. It's kind of become a small group. But in these days, this was like the other Communist Party. The Communist Party had maybe 100,000 members. They had maybe 10,000 members, maybe 20,000 members. They weren't huge, but, communism was very popular, and they were the knockoff brand of communism that was against the Soviet leaders. But when the SWP was formed, Trotskyism in America had two wings. There were two distinct groups. There were members of the Teamsters Union, and there were New York intellectuals. And this is very interesting. So the leader of the Teamsters Union was Daniel J. Tobin. That's the guy who was basically the founder and leader of the Teamsters Union. And Daniel J. Tobin was part of the American Federation of Labor. And the Teamsters were what was considered to be a right-wing union. First of all, many Teamsters locals banned non-white people from joining. They were whites only. On top of that, they were part of the American Federation of Labor. On top of that, they had a ban on Communist Party members being involved. And the Teamsters was a union for truck drivers, guys who drove trucks. It actually comes from, before they had trucks, they had wagons, and wagons would be led by a team of horses. And the guy who whipped the horses and said, yeah, go, that guy was called the Teamster because he was whipping the horses. And so the Teamsters Union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, is a union for truck drivers. Once they had trucks, they still called them Teamsters. Now, what Tobin did, the way he set up his union was basically if your trucking company signed a contract with the Teamsters, he would then do advertising for you. Buy at this company because they are a union company. And that was basically how the Teamsters Union worked, right? If a trucking company signed a contract, then Tobin would spend the union dues money putting up billboards in the town, shop at this store because it has union labor. And it was what you might call a business union. It was kind of a corrupt union. And what's interesting is they didn't like Roosevelt. And this is where it gets interesting. Roosevelt, you would think, all the labor union leaders would like Roosevelt. That was not the case, right? For example, Roosevelt hired millions of people to be unemployed workers. He hired millions of unemployed workers to work at the Works Progress Administration. Well, he was taking jobs away from union construction workers, and he was taking jobs away from union pipe fitters, and all those guys that were getting Works Progress Administration wages to build bridges and stuff. They were taking jobs away from unions. A lot of labor unions really didn't like Roosevelt hiring all these unemployed, for example. And there were other things that Roosevelt did that it was complicated. The CIO loved Roosevelt and was very solidly behind Roosevelt, and the Communist Party was behind him. But Daniel J. Tobin wasn't so much. Now, he went to the White House. He met with Roosevelt. He supported him in some elections, but not every election. There was kind of a back and forth, and they didn't always support the Democrats. And especially later in the 1950s, the Teamsters were very much a Republican union. And even in these days, they weren't very much. They were considered a conservative right-wing union. They were AFL. They were not CIO, and they were kind of a business union. They didn't. In a lot of places they were racist, and they were known. They had this advertising hustle, where they would advertise. A lot of times people would make contracts with them as a way to get advertising, and they were kind of corrupt. Regardless, in Minneapolis, in the city of Minneapolis, the Teamsters Union was taken over by Trotskyists. And these two Trotskyist leaders, James Cannon and Farrell Dobbs, became the leaders of the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis. And I guess, Robert's Rules of Order, and they were just, they didn't like the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was banned from unions, and through, political maneuvering in Minneapolis, the Teamsters Union was run by Trotskyists. And in 1934, Minneapolis was shut down by a Teamsters strike, and they shut down the whole city. It was a real general strike. They keep having general strikes lately against Trump. They're not general strikes. They're parades. The Democrats, they want to not like Trump, and so they say, we're having a general strike, and that means all the Democrats get together and have a parade. But when Minneapolis had a real general strike in 1934, no trucks would drive on the street because the union was out there on the street with baseball bats and signs that said no scab trucks. And if you didn't have a union pass on your truck, they bashed your windows in. Food was not delivered to stores. The electricity shut off. I mean, the whole city was brought to a grinding halt, and they set up big speakers in downtown Minneapolis to blare their propaganda. And their slogan was "Make Minneapolis a Union Town." And they won. And that they unionized all the truck drivers of Minneapolis. And the Trotskyites infiltrated the Teamsters Union, and they did a pretty good job. And in the Midwestern United States, in Minneapolis, and eventually in Nebraska, and a lot of Midwestern states, the Teamsters Union, the radical wing of the Teamsters Union, was led by Trotskyists. And this guy, Farrell Dobbs, was considered one of their most important leaders. There was also another guy named Carl Skoglund. There was a guy named Bill Brown. And that a lot of these Teamster leaders in the Midwest were Trotskyists. However, in New York City, Trotskyism was very, very different. It wasn't truck drivers like Farrell Dobbs. It was intellectuals. And there was a guy named Max Shachtman, and Max Shachtman had been a founder of the Communist Party. He'd been kicked out as a follower of Trotsky, and he was a very well-known socialist speaker and writer in New York City who was a prominent Trotskyist. And there was a magazine that was very popular on the college campuses called Partisan Review, and it originally had been a Communist Party magazine. It had gone out of business, and then it relaunched as they called it an anti-Stalinist left publication. And a lot of college professors wrote for it. Sidney Hook was a very well-known socialist college professor in New York City. James Burnham was the head of the philosophy department at New York University. Dwight MacDonald was a very well-known writer and essayist. Mary McCarthy was also very well-known. And these people, these were academics. These were college professors and writers, and they wrote for this magazine called Partisan Review, and they were part of the Socialist Workers' Party, and they were Trotskyists. There was also a guy named Irving Howe, and Irving Howe was a young guy. He was in his early 20s, and he was the leader of a group called the Young People's Socialist League, and it was the college organization of the Trotskyists. And Irving Howe was the leader of it. And, they had a newspaper, and they worked against the Communist Party on the college campuses. The Communist Party's youth group was called the Young Communist League, and the Trotskyist youth group was called YPSL, Young People's Socialist League. And that was the New York City SWP. The SWP was two parties in one. You had the Teamsters and the truck drivers, and then you had the New York intellectuals. So then in 1939 is a really important year in the history of the world. That's the year that World War II happened. And a number of things happened very, very quickly in the lead up to World War II. And it was a very confusing time politically. In the fall, in April 1st of 1939, Spain became a fascist country, right? There had been a civil war in Spain. The Spanish Civil War had been going on. And the Spanish Republic, the elected government, had a lot of communists in it. And communists from all over the world had gone to Spain to defend the Republic, and they lost. And Franco, who was supported by Hitler and Mussolini, he became the dictator of Spain. And on April 1st, 1939, the Spanish Republic was abolished, and Spain became a fascist dictatorship. Hitler and Mussolini gained one more country. The Spanish Republic fell. Only two countries in the world had supported the Spanish Republic, the Soviet Union and Mexico. The Mexican government was kind of a populist government during these days because of the Mexican Revolution, and the Soviet Union was anti-fascist, and those were the only two countries in the world that had supported the Spanish Republic. And the U.S. government had actually banned any support for the Spanish Republic with the Neutrality Act. They made it a crime. And a lot of Americans risked going to jail. Thousands of Americans went and fought in Spain. But finally, April 1st, 1939, the Spanish Republic fell. After the Spanish Republic fell, the Soviet Union knew what was going to happen next, which was that the Nazis were going to invade them. The Nazi government was already expanding. They had seized the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. They had seized Austria, and they knew that the Nazis were planning to invade them. So on August 23rd of 1939, the Soviet Union signed a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that was a big change. Nobody saw it coming because the Soviet Union had been leading anti-fascist demonstrations all over the world. And they had been trying to build a united front against fascism. And the communists were always screaming against fascism. But then in August of 1939, they signed this temporary non-aggression pact with Hitler. And basically what they did is they drew a line down Europe. And the understanding was Hitler wouldn't move his army on one side of it, and the Nazis wouldn't move their army, and the Soviet Union wouldn't move their army to the other side of it. It was a line down Europe we won't cross. And that's all it was. It was not an alliance. It was a temporary non-aggression pact. And it was a really big deal because many people in the global communist movement were totally confused. They said, our whole political identity is fighting against fascism. Why would we sign this pact with the Nazis? And immediately after that, there was a huge, huge campaign against communists in American media because Roosevelt was the president, because Hitler was the enemy, and Roosevelt had been aligned with the communists, and then the communists turned around and signed this deal. It was said that the communists were fake. They were hypocrites. They were insincere, right? That they claimed that they were against fascism, but then they turned around and signed this pact, and that was a huge betrayal. The communists betrayed America. The saying was the communists weren't really loyal to America. They were taking orders from Moscow, and that communism, and a lot of the U.S. press said that communism and Nazism were the same. They were both totalitarianism, and they were the same. And Time magazine started calling the Communist Party the Communazis. And on September 1st, World War II officially started. Hitler invaded Poland. And when Hitler invaded Poland, the Polish government collapsed. The Nazis overtook the country. But the line that they had drawn down Europe, the Nazis brought their forces right up to the line. And the Soviet Union, seeing that the Nazis were getting closer, they brought their forces right up to the line. And then they shook hands. There was a handshake. Now, at no point did the Polish government in exile ever declare war against the Soviet Union. The Polish government collapsed. It fled to Britain. And from Britain, they declared war against Hitler. They did not declare war against the Soviet Union. The U.S. media said that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had a, quote, joint invasion of Poland. That's not true. The Nazis invaded Poland, and the Soviet Union brought their forces right up to the line. It was not a joint invasion, okay? And that's really important to understand. If it had been a joint invasion, the Polish government would have declared war on the Soviet Union also. The Polish government in exile did not do that. And I heard this. If you go to college, they'll tell you, well, Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland together. No, they didn't. Hitler invaded Poland, and Stalin brought his forces right up to the line. And shortly after that, the Soviet Union invaded Finland because they wanted to be positioned, because they knew the Nazis would inevitably break the pact. They knew the Nazis were going to attack them at some point. And so they were moving their forces as far as they could in advance to prepare for the inevitable Nazi invasion. This is important history. Now, after the invasion of Poland and after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, the leader of the Communist Party was a guy named Earl Browder. And Earl Browder had been a good friend of Roosevelt in the Roosevelt administration, and he was the leader of the Communist Party. But because of the fact that the Soviet Union signed this temporary non-aggression pact with Hitler, Earl Browder was indicted for passport fraud. And he was thrown in federal prison for a few months because he allegedly lied in his form about filling out, applying for a U.S. passport. It was a completely bullshit prosecution, completely bullshit. And it was malarkey. But it was like that one of the questions on his passport form could have been interpreted one way or another way. And I think he was required to list everywhere he had traveled on his passport. And he had gone to the Soviet Union without a passport at one point. And, he had like gone without a passport, which you used to be able to do. People would do back in those days. They would sneak onto ships and stuff. And he didn't disclose that on his form. And it was like a way of interpreting the form that he had lied on the form. It was really, they stretched the law to throw Earl Browder in prison to stick it to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was, had signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler, had angered the American government. Now, somewhere I have, in 1940, the Communist Party ran a presidential election campaign. Somewhere I have their book. I have the book from that campaign. If I am mistaken, I'm just trying to get a look at my bookshelf here. 1940, the Communist Party ran Earl Browder for president. He got out of prison, but he was still on parole. So Earl Browder was not able to travel for his presidential campaign. So he recorded an audio book, like a vinyl record for his presidential campaign. It was called The Most Peculiar Election. And in that recording, he accused Roosevelt of being a warmonger. And keep in mind, the communists had been a big part of the Roosevelt coalition. But yet, in 1940, they ran a presidential election campaign. I'm sorry, I can't find my copy of Earl Browder's book. But they ran an election campaign against Earl Browder, or against Roosevelt, on the platform that Roosevelt was a warmonger. And they began loudly advocating for the independence of Puerto Rico. And they ran a campaign that was very much an anti-war pacifist campaign. And Trotsky actually urged his American followers to endorse Earl Browder in the election. And that's very, very odd, because Trotsky generally opposed anything that the Soviet Union did. But at the one time where the Soviet Union is kind of softening its stance against Nazi Germany, suddenly Trotsky was all on board. And the Trotskyist leaders were preparing, when World War II broke out, they were going to infiltrate the U.S. armed forces and form unions among the soldiers and have the soldiers go on strike to disrupt the war effort. And they were indicted for this by the U.S. Department of Justice, and the leaders of Trotsky's organization were sent to federal prison during this time as well. And then on August 21st, 1940, Trotsky himself was killed in Mexico City. He was killed by an assassin, put an ice pick through his head. So all of this happened in 1939 and 1940. Right? These are all dramatic events. And, by 1941, Pearl Harbor had happened. The Soviet Union had been invaded. And then Earl Browder was let out of prison, and the Communist Party's members all enlisted in the army and became the biggest supporters of the Second World War. But in this period, 1939 to 1940, where the Soviet Union had just signed a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis, where the Communist Party was being portrayed as public enemy number one, as insincere, the Trotskyist movement was very, very confused, because their whole orientation had been that the Communist Party, they're a bunch of sellouts for supporting Roosevelt, and we're the real revolutionaries. And now, all of a sudden, the Communist Party had signed this temporary non-aggression pact with Hitler, and Trotsky supported them doing that. He said they did it in an unprincipled way. They should have communicated it better, but he had no objection to them doing it. He thought it was okay to do the pact. He said he would have signed a pact with Hitler even earlier. But yet, the American Trotskyists didn't know what to do. Now, this is actually a song. The American Trotskyists had their own, recording studio, and they had an album. They had a vinyl record of Trotskyist songs making fun of the Communist Party. This is an actual Trotskyist song from 1939, composed by Trotskyists to make fun of the Communist Party. I've sung it on these streams before. I'm not going to sing it tonight. I'm just going to play the recording. Here we go.
In old Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of '39, sat a Russian and a Prussian writing out the party line. Oh my darling, oh my darling party line. Oh, I never will desert you, for I love this life of mine. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi, oh, we knew it for a fact. Pravda said it, we all read it, before the Stalin-Hitler pact. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling party line. Oh, I never will desert you, for I love this life of mine. Once a Nazi would be shot, see, that was then the party line. Now a Nazi's hotsy-totsy, Trotsky's laying British mines. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling party line. Oh, I never will desert you, for I love this life of mine. Now the Nazis and their Führers stand within the party line. All the Russians love the Prussians, Volga boatmen sail the Rhine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling party line. Oh, I never will desert you, for I love this life of mine.
Yeah, and the American Trotskyist movement never gotten bounced. I think this has happened before. They bounced me from the stream. I don't know. It didn't like the song, I guess. Anyway, right. So, you know, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 very much confused the Trotskyist movement, but Trotsky supported it and said the Soviet Union had the right to do it, that he would have done it sooner. This is right before Trotsky's death, but there was a big fight within the SWP, and the leader of the SWP opposition was Max Shachtman. And folks, I got to tell you, Max Shachtman is one of the most important people in 20th century American politics. And it's really bizarre because outside of communist politics, people don't know his name. But as we'll talk about later on this stream, if you talk about American politics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it all gets back to Max Shachtman. All over the left, all over the right, Democrats, Republicans, United Nations, State Department, labor unions, it all gets back to this guy. It's really bizarre. This guy was the leader of the opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party, Max Shachtman. Now, Max Shachtman said his primary disagreement with the SWP was the Russian question. He didn't feel that the Soviet Union should be supported in World War II, and he didn't feel that the Soviet Union was actually a deformed workers' state. And he said it was what he called bureaucratic collectivism. It wasn't socialism, but it wasn't capitalism. It was the rule of bureaucrats. It was this new system that had developed. And he said that Nazi Germany was the same system. It was bureaucrat collectivism. But in addition to disagreements about the Russian question, he accused the SWP of practicing cult of the leader. That sound familiar? Cult of the leader. And he didn't like Trotsky. He said Trotsky had too much power and too much authority. And he accused the SWP of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party had what he called the Cannon regime. James Cannon was the leader, had the Cannon regime, and he was running the SWP in an authoritarian way. And he announced that he was a third camp Trotskyist. That Trotsky maintained there were two camps in the world: the imperialist camp and the working class camp. Well, Shachtman said he was for the third camp. He wasn't for the Soviet Union, and he wasn't for Western imperialism. He was for the third camp, and he founded Third Camp Trotskyism. Now, Leon Trotsky wrote a book against Max Shachtman. It was called In Defense of Marxism. And James Cannon, the leader of the SWP, he wrote a book against Max Shachtman called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, which I actually recommend. It's a pretty good book. And basically, the New York intellectuals that were grouped around Max Shachtman, Martin Aburn, and James Burnham, they were middle-class pessimists. Instead of celebrating the Soviet Union and seeing the Soviet Union as the force for good in the world, and they weren't blatantly supporting U.S. imperialism, they said that both sides are bad, and this was considered to be an expression of petty bourgeois fatalism or middle class pessimism, right? That they were fighting for the petty bourgeoisie, right? Marxism teaches that there's the working class, the proletariat, the wage worker. There's the capitalists who own the means of production, but there's also what's called the petty bourgeoisie, and those are the small business owners. They own their own bar, they own their own restaurant. The lawyer has his own practice. The professor is a tenured professor who has a good paying job teaching students or a skill. People that are not wage workers, but they technically own their own business or have their own practice or their own independence. Doctors, lawyers, small business owners, etc. But they're not part of the ultra ruling class. They're not part of the big monopolies that actually run the country. And so the petty bourgeoisie is a class that in this time it was argued, and I think very accurately, that the petty bourgeoisie saw that they were going to be defeated. And this became especially clear after World War II, that they were alienated from U.S. imperialism because that was the rule of the big monopolies. But they were also alienated from the Soviet Union because that meant that their property would be nationalized and they would be absorbed into a state-run economy. And that the petty bourgeoisie celebrates its individuality and its independence. And it saw it threatened. The world was gripped by collectivism in the 1930s. Communism was on the rise, and as capitalism was threatened by communism, capitalism was turning into fascism, and fascism is also a collectivist authoritarian movement. So individualism and the freedom of the individual was under attack, and the New York intellectuals were a layer of people that had been communists that were clinging to their individuality. And were threatened by the notion of joining a mass movement. And this is what James Cannon wrote when criticizing them. He said, for the proletarian revolutionist, the party is the concentrated expression of his life purpose, and he is bound to it for life and death. He practices and preaches party patriotism, because he knows that his socialist ideal cannot be realized without the party. In his eyes, the crime of crimes is disloyalty or irresponsibility to the party. The proletarian revolutionist is proud of his party. He defends it before the world on all occasions. The proletarian revolutionist is a disciplined man, and since the party cannot exist as a combat organization without discipline. But then he describes the New York intellectuals. He says that they're not party patriots. He says the moment his toes are stepped on or he is rebuffed, he forgets all about the interests of the movement and remembers only that his feelings have been hurt. The revolution may be important, but the wounded vanity of the petty bourgeois intellectual is more important. He is all for discipline when he's laying down the law to others. But as soon as he finds himself in the minority, he begins to deliver ultimatums and threats of a split to the party majority. And this is something, when building CPI, that's one thing I've learned. We don't, when people come along and say, well, I'm going to quit if blank, 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 we generally say, okay, see ya. You don't want to work with such people because they're not loyal to the organization. Right? It's one thing if people have suggestions, but if people are suddenly, they don't get what they want, they're threatening to leave, that means they're not loyal to the organization, right? And that any illiberal organization must develop party patriotism. People must be loyal to the project, not simply loyal to being in a group because it can advance their own interests. They must see the project, the party, the organization as essential, party patriotism. And that is one thing that middle-class intellectuals don't have. And that is one thing that CPI has developed. And that's one thing we've learned is essential. We've had various people who join us because they think it'll make them more internet famous or it'll advance their careers. Well, those people don't last. The people who are our most loyal people, when I think about the people that have taken on leadership roles, the people who are our captains around the country, like Penny in Minneapolis, like Noah in Boston, Dan in Los Angeles, Gabby in Chicago, right? They are people that are loyal to the project. They're not trying to use the project to make themselves more famous. They're not trying to, to become, it's not a vehicle to advance themselves. They see the project as essential, and that's really, really important. Party patriotism. And that's what the New York intellectuals did not have. And their big thing was they equated Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as being the same system. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were not the same. They were both highly authoritarian countries. They were both countries where, you had a large military. They were both countries where you had one ruling party. But other than that, there were very, very, very big differences in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was a society where the economy was focused on degrowth. Germany was an industrial organization, an industrialized country, and the Great Depression had come along, and Hitler rebooted the German economy with destruction by creating a slave labor underclass, by increasing military spending. They say he put half the country in prison uniforms and the other half of the country in military uniforms. I mean, it's not that simple, but largely it was degrowth. And, I quote in my various other books about how reverse inflation, reducing the amount of money in circulation and basically making the population poorer, reduced unemployment and stabilized the economy. And war was essential. The reason that Hitler started seizing territory was because their economy needed more slave laborers and they needed more military spending. And the Nazi regime basically backed itself up into a corner in order to have to go to war. And you can read Arpalm Dutt's great book called Fascism and Social Revolution. Also, this book, Dialectical Economics by Lynn Marcus, has a lot about the economics of Nazi Germany in it. I would also recommend you just read my big book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. I have a whole chapter about degrowth and fascism as degrowth. But this was the nature of Nazi economics. So that's important to keep in mind. But according to the New York intellectuals, they were the same, and they were both state capitalism or bureaucrat collectivism. So they quit the Socialist Workers' Party, and they formed their third camp Trotskyist movement led by Max Shachtman. And some of them quit immediately. James Burnham is a very interesting figure. Google James Burnham. James Burnham was the head of the philosophy department at New York University, and he led the fight in the SWP, and he and Max Shachtman and Martin Abraham, they all quit. And they had the founding meeting of the U.S. Workers' Party, which was the Shachtmanite group. And just a few days later, he delivered a letter to their office and said, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And he signed up for the U.S. Intelligence Services and went to work for the Office of Secret Service, which was the precursor, the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. So what was going on there, right? This guy had been he'd been a Trotskyist for a number of years. He was just this college professor, and suddenly he was a Trotskyist. He was writing for Partisan Review. And there's a big fight in Trotskyism, and he starts a new Trotskyist group. And then the next day he says, I'm out of here, and joins the U.S. Intelligence Services. Very, very bizarre. Very, very, very bizarre behavior, right? The Trotskyists had opposed and did oppose World War II. But yet, as soon as they form their own wing of Trotskyism, he goes and joins the CIA. Very mysterious. And James Burnham became one of the most prominent conservatives during the McCarthy period. He wrote for Monthly Review magazine, and he was a big McCarthyist and witch hunter and anti-communist red hunter. So that's a very mysterious thing. You could argue that maybe James Burnham was the first neocon because he went right from Trotskyism to the CIA, or to the intelligence services, and to the Republican Party. Most of the other third camp Trotskyists, it took a lot longer. It took decades. But he went boom, boom, right? From Trotskyism to the intelligence agencies and to the Republicans, to the conservatives. Very interesting. But after World War II, U.S. politics very dramatically changed. McCarthyism, right? Well, first of all, you had a booming economy in the United States. After World War II, the rest of the world had been blown up. Every major city in Western Europe and in Asia had been destroyed. Japan was a huge industrial country. They'd been destroyed. Germany destroyed. France destroyed. Italy destroyed. And so the world had to rebuild. And America was the only major Western country that didn't have war on its own territory. So the whole world had to buy their steel from America. They had to buy their cars from America. They had to buy their airplanes from America. And America had a boom. And American industrial workers saw their wages go up. They had been unionized by the Communist Party. They were in industrial unions. They saw their wages go up very dramatically. And that's the 1950s, the American dream, the white picket fence and the car. And so the Communist Party's message of the workers against the bosses and class struggle, it didn't really go over. Secondly, a new invention existed, television. All these Americans had TV sets in their homes. And every night, there were a lot of people had only 3 channels, but all 3 of those channels broadcast propaganda about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union is going to kill you. Stalin is trying to take over the world. And so you had an American public that saw their standard of living go up. You had an American public that, had just been through the trauma of a war. And suddenly they all have this box in their living room that is telling them, be very afraid of communism. And in that atmosphere, the Communist Party USA was crushed. And 200 leaders of the Communist Party went to federal prison. The Communist Party was outlawed. It was illegal to send communist material through the mail. Communist Party members lost their Social Security benefits at one point. It was pretty bad. And if you were a communist, the FBI would come to your job and get you fired. It was not a good time. Not a good time to be a communist in the United States. But amazingly, the Communist Party still did amazing things during these years. For example, they were able to organize the Civil Rights Congress. And William L. Patterson, who was a leader of the Civil Rights Congress, was brought by the Soviet Union to the United Nations to give a speech condemning racism and Jim Crow segregation called We Charge Genocide. They circulated that speech all over America. The Communist Party was still able to do amazing things. One of the amazing things that the Communist Party did during these years was they organized the Waldorf Peace Conference, which was a conference at a hotel, the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. And it was a conference that was pro-Soviet. And W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous black intellectual, spoke. Albert Einstein, the famous physicist, spoke. Aaron Copland, the famous music composer, spoke. Lillian Hellman, the famous playwright. Will Geer, the famous actor. All kinds of people that were in Hollywood, that were writers or scientists or academics came and spoke at this pro-Soviet conference. And it was infuriating to the CIA because New York City was home to the United Nations. They had to grant visas for all these prominent Soviet officials to come. Shostakovich, the famous Soviet composer, came and spoke to it. And that the CIA was just furious to see all these great scientists and intellectuals supporting the communists. So because of that, the CIA said, we need to beat the communists at their own game. So there was an organization called the Committee for Cultural Freedom, and it had been formed by these third camp Trotskyists. The leader of it was a guy named Sidney Hook. And Sidney Hook wrote for Partisan Review. Sidney Hook had been a Trotskyist who had, been with Max Shachtman, been a third camp Trotskyist. And he had the Committee for Cultural Freedom that was against the Soviet Union and against the American government and against the Nazis. It was just for cultural and intellectual freedom. And the Committee for Cultural Freedom sat down with the CIA and they disrupted the Waldorf Peace Conference. They intercepted its mail. They sent out fake press releases in the name of the Waldorf Peace Conference. They marched into the Waldorf Peace Conference and they disrupted the Waldorf Peace Conference. They did everything they could to wreck the Waldorf Peace Conference, with the CIA helping them do it. And afterwards, the CIA began funding what they called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Committee for Cultural Freedom became the Congress, the International Congress for Cultural Freedom. The director of the International Congress for Cultural Freedom was this guy, Irving Kristol. And Irving Kristol was a follower of Max Shachtman. And he got the job, the paid job of running the Congress for Cultural Freedom. One of the main things that the Congress for Cultural Freedom did was fund magazines. Partisan Review magazine in America, Encounter magazine in Britain, Paris Review in France, Der Monat in Germany. And these were leftist magazines that had articles condemning capitalism, condemning American imperialism, condemning McCarthyism, criticizing American movies, American art and culture, but also condemning the Soviet Union and waging kind of hate cancel culture campaigns against the writers and intellectuals who did defend the Soviet Union. They tried to get people fired from their jobs. They tried to get people's speaking gigs canceled. They tried to make sure that communist writers didn't win awards, and they rallied the intellectuals against the pro-Soviet intellectuals. And that was the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Partisan Review, and nobody knew it was paid for by the CIA. It looked like it was just a group of intellectuals who believed in freedom and were against American imperialism, but also against those dirty communists. But it was all being funded. It was all a deep state operation, and we now know that. That's all public record. You read about the Cultural Cold War. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom did all kinds of stuff. They funded art galleries. They promoted abstract art and modern art because they said that social realist art from the Soviet Union was totalitarian. And they said that if you just have shapes, why, that's freedom. And they promoted the art of Jackson Pollock. And they promoted all kinds of stuff. And they were changing the way art works. And they were changing, and that they started arguing that what they called the fascist aesthetic was that when art is preaching about right and wrong, when it's glorifying strength, this is fascism, right? Susan Sontag is one of the intellectuals who's made famous by Partisan Review. And she claims that, that gymnastics is fascist, physical fitness is fascist, all kinds of stuff is fascist. And then she later says that she thinks communism is nothing but the most effective form of fascism. Very crazy. And Partisan Review is staffed by all these third camp Trotskyists, and they're what you call the new left. They're not Marxists, but they're critical of American imperialism, and they write articles condemning McCarthyism. They write articles condemning America, and they're the new left. Eventually, you have the New Left Review that gets published. You have the Frankfurt School in Germany, right? Der Monat magazine is how all of them are getting paid, but Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno and all of these leftist thinkers that are suddenly very popular in American academia that are calling themselves Marxists, they're all being paid for and subsidized by the CIA. And they're all promoting this idea that it's about opposing totalitarianism, and that communism is one form of totalitarianism, fascism is another form, and we need to celebrate individualism, and that optimism is very, very dangerous, and that optimism must be opposed. Optimism is totalitarian, right? That's the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which the CIA considers one of its most successful programs. Now, Max Shachtman, this guy, right? That was his picture over here, right? Like I said, his followers are all over the American political spectrum. These are a few of Max Shachtman's followers. Michael Harrington, the founder of DSA, was a Shachtmanite. Irving Howe, New York Times intellectual, also part of DSA when it started, as New York intellectual, follower of Max Shachtman. Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, New York intellectual, follower of Max Shachtman. Jean Kirkpatrick, UN ambassador under Ronald Reagan. She was also a follower of Max Shachtman, a member of the Young People's Socialist League. Carl Gershman, the director of the National Endowment for Democracy. He was a Shachtmanite, follower of Max Shachtman, member of the Young People's Socialist League. Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal advisor, was a Shachtmanite, follower of Max Shachtman, Young People's Socialist League. Penn Kemble was with the State Department. He was a Shachtmanite. Daniel Bell, a prominent intellectual out of Harvard, Shachtmanite. Nathan Glazer, Irving Brown, Rachel Horowitz, one of the Democratic Party's labor strategists. Rachel had all of these people are connected to Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was George Meany's personal advisor. George Meany was the head of the AFL-CIO during the 1960s, and Max Shachtman ran his office for him. Max Shachtman, this guy who was the father of third camp Trotskyism, the Trotskyist who broke with Trotsky, he is connected to a lot of the Democratic Party leaders, and he's connected to a lot of the Republican leaders, right? Irving Kristol, his son Bill Kristol runs the Weekly Standard. Jean Kirkpatrick was a big celebrity in the Reagan administration, UN ambassador. right? Michael Harrington started DSA. All over the American political spectrum, you find followers of Max Shachtman, this former Communist Party member who became a Trotskyist, who broke with Trotsky. Now, Irving Kristol, who was the head of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, who was the follower of Max Shachtman, his New York Times obituary tells us how he stopped being a socialist. This is what it said. Drafted into the army with a number of Midwesterners who were street tough and often anti-Semitic, he found himself shedding his youthful, radical optimism. I can't build socialism with these people, he concluded. They'll probably take it over and make a racket out of it. Right? So he had believed in the working class, but then he got drafted and he actually met working class people and he didn't like them. And that's how he became a conservative. Isn't that wild? Right? That's pretty, it doesn't get more blatant than that. Blatant classism, blatant contempt for the masses. But as the 1960s go on, you have the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Bay of Pigs invasion happens. That's the Kennedy administration that does that. And these third camp Trotskyists support it because Fidel Castro is a quote unquote Stalinist. And they say, well, it's necessary. And Max Shachtman's followers, people start calling them the State Department Socialists because they echo the State Department line. They supported the Bay of Pigs invasion and they support the Vietnam War because, hey, Stalin is the main enemy. Now, this guy starts to become a celebrity. Max Shachtman has a young protege, a guy named Michael Harrington. This guy, Michael Harrington. Let me put a picture of Michael Harrington on the screen. Michael Harrington is a young college student in the 1950s who is interested in socialism and communism, and he meets Max Shachtman, and he becomes like Max Shachtman's protege, Max Shachtman's, student, and he wrote a book called The Other America, and it was a best-selling book, and it was about poverty in America, and Lyndon Johnson hired him as an advisor. This is Michael Harrington, to make a lot of the poverty programs that the Lyndon Johnson administration created. Head Start. Have you ever heard of the Head Start program? That comes from Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty program. And Michael Harrington designed it. And Michael Harrington was this prominent, well-known liberal writer who was a socialist, who supported the Bay of Pigs invasion and supported the Vietnam War, but was very much in favor of labor unions, very much in favor of a welfare state. And he was trained by Max Shachtman, and he was a prominent figure that it was advising people in the federal government. And he was a follower of Max Shachtman. He's one of these third camp Trotskyists, and he was a figure in what you could call the New Left, Michael Harrington. So what happens next? 1967, you had the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, or the Suez War. And that was when Israel went to war with the Arab world, largely with Egypt, that was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was an Arab socialist, but also with, all the Arab countries. And the Soviet Union supported the Arab countries. America supported Israel. And it's during that war that the USS Liberty was attacked, right? The USS Liberty was an American ship, and Israel intentionally attacked it and killed 33 sailors. Why? It appears that Israel wanted to frame the Soviet Union for doing it, or frame Egypt for doing it. It was a false flag. They wanted to draw America into the war. They failed to do it. They weren't able to draw America into the war, but that seemed to be their goal. They wanted to bring America into the conflict. They wanted to, say that the ship had been attacked by the Soviets. And the Arab-Israeli War, anybody that was an anti-imperialist was supporting the Palestinians and supporting the Arabs. And during the war, the Soviet Union diplomatically recognized the Palestinian resistance. And the Soviet Union became solidly against Israel. The Soviet Union had technically supported Israel at the beginning, but then they started finding Israeli spies in the early 1950s and executing them. And Israel was accusing them of anti-Semitism and spying on them. And then finally, 1967, Soviet Union says we're completely against Israel and takes the side of the Arab countries. And that's when the global left was solidly against Israel. Well, these New York intellectuals, they don't like that at all. Irving Howe writes an article for the New York Times Review of Books saying that these students that are protesting Israel are all anti-Semitic. Does that sound familiar? And a lot of these Shackmanites are just horrified that the young peace activists marching against the Vietnam War, that they're supporting the Palestinians. And they also don't like that the anti-war movement increasingly is waving the flag of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. And they had loved Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but as the Black Panthers got to grow in popularity, that was making them nervous. 1968 is a pivotal year in the history of America. So 1968 begins with the Tet Offensive, where the Vietnamese start just kicking America's ass. Out of nowhere, there's just an explosion of Vietnamese resistance to America. America takes really dramatic losses. The Tet Offensive. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is murdered and assassinated. Every single major city in America goes up in flames. There's rebellions that sweep the country. The National Guard is sent out. It's like chaos in the streets. And amid all of this, everyone's very confused. So Richard Nixon wins the presidential election, saying that he's appealing to the silent majority that doesn't like the Black Freedom Movement and that doesn't like the campus anti-war protests, the silent majority. There's a hit song during these years called Okie from Muskogee. And it's about how ordinary people in America, you know, they don't like those protesters and they love their country and they don't like rioting. And that there's this whole blowback against the left. The left is seen as a bunch of disobedient, crazy, hippie college kids and Black people that are just complaining or whatever. And it's, you know, white, ordinary middle America is tired of this and they're the silent majority. So Richard Nixon wins the election. What's interesting is a lot of these guys, right? Not Michael Harrington, he was for the Democrats, but a lot of these Yipsel guys like Irving Kristol, they support Richard Nixon because they are so horrified by the left. They're so against, quote unquote, Stalinism, and they don't want Vietnam to win. And they're horrified by the Arab-Israeli war and the left supporting the Palestinians and not supporting Israel. A lot of them support Nixon because they think the new left is out of control. 1972 is when Nixon is running for re-election. And in that election, Max Shachtman, this guy, he is a very important leader of the labor unions in the Democratic Party. He's the advisor to George Meany of the AFL-CIO. And he is originally supporting the Democrats. He's supporting Henry Jackson, who's kind of a moderate Democrat who supports the Vietnam War. When Henry Jackson loses the primary and the Democrats nominate, who did the Democrats nominate that year? George McGovern, I believe. He says George McGovern is too far left. He's too soft on communism. So Max Shachtman endorses Richard Nixon and supports Nixon in the final years of his life. So this Trotskyist endorses Richard Nixon. And in addition to that, Irving Kristol had already supported Nixon in 1968 because he couldn't stand the left. And that a lot of these former Trotskyists are supporting the Republicans because they are, quote unquote, anti-Stalinist. And they are so opposed to Vietnam. They're so opposed to China and the Soviet Union. They're so supportive of Israel. They may call themselves socialists, but they're so opposed to, quote unquote, Stalinism that they can't handle it. Now, 1972, the Socialist Party of America collapsed. So what was the Socialist Party? Before the Communist Party was formed, you had the Socialist Party. It was led by, Eugene Debs, was not a member, but he would run for president on their ticket. It was a mass organization of people that believed in socialism. And then when the Russian Revolution happened, all the people that supported the Russian Revolution formed the Communist Party. And the Socialist Party was this broad tent group of people that didn't support the Soviet Union, but were for socialism, but not the Soviet kind. And after Eugene Debs died, Norman Thomas, Reverend Norman Thomas, an Episcopal minister, became the leader of the Socialist Party. And they were the alternative to the Communist Party. The Communist Party was aligned with the Soviet Union and with China, and the Socialist Party was a good, wholesome organization of socialists who weren't like the bad ones. And Max Shachtman's followers merged into the Socialist Party. For a while, they had their own group called the Independent Socialist League, but eventually they merged into the Socialist Party. And, Michael Harrington was a leader of the Socialist Party. And a lot of these people were in the Socialist Party. But 1972 is the year of the Richard Nixon's reelection. And that year they collapsed because they couldn't decide what to do about the Vietnam War. And they split into 3 different groups. The first group was called the Socialist Party USA. And it was led by a guy named David McReynolds. And David McReynolds was a pacifist who was a draft resistor, had refused to fight in Vietnam. And he formed the War Resisters League. And he was the first openly gay man to run for president. And he would run for president on the Socialist Party ticket. And they ran for office in the name of socialism. And they're still around. They run for office every year in the elections, the Socialist Party USA. And that was the first group. The next group that was formed was led by Michael Harrington, and they were called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. That's what's now called Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. Michael Harrington and Irving Howe, the intellectual, they formed Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. They had originally supported the Vietnam War, but by this time they were saying they were against it. The USA needed to negotiate an end with Vietnam. They said it took them a long time, but they were against the Vietnam War. But there was a third faction called Social Democrats USA. And they were the Neocons. They supported the Vietnam War because they said that we have to fight Stalinism. And eventually they became supporters of Ronald Reagan. And that is where the Neocons come from. And a lot of them, it's very interesting, a lot of them studied Sovietology, right? Because these were people that had been communists. They'd been in the Communist Party. They'd been followers of Trotsky. Many of them spoke Russian. And in American academia, there was a field that developed in these years, in the 70s and 80s, called Sovietology, which was you would study the Soviet Union, you would learn to speak Russian, and you would study Nazi Germany. And you would learn that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the model, were the same system, that's the belief of these third camp Trotskyists. They were the same system, and they were models of totalitarianism, and that America's job was to fight against totalitarianism. And the main intellectual influence on neoconservatism, in addition to Irving Kristol, was a guy named Leo Strauss. And I'll put his image on the screen. Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss was never a Trotskyist, but Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor who had lived in Nazi Germany and had fled to New York City, and had taught at NYU for a while. And then he taught at the University of Chicago. And Leo Strauss was the intellectual influence on the field of Sovietology and on the Neocons. And he and Irving Kristol were quite close. And Leo Strauss's big book is called Philosophy and the Art of Writing. Persecution and the Art of Writing. And in his book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, he argues that all the great philosophers of history have had to write in code because if the masses of people found out what they really think, they would persecute them. And he believes that some people are just naturally better than others. And he draws from Plato. Plato preached that there were certain people that were called the philosopher kings. And Plato talks about the myth of the metals, this theory that different jobs that people had flowed from different metal that they had in their blood. The ancient Greeks could detect that you had iron or some metal in your blood. And so they had the theory that different people had different iron in their blood or different metal in their blood. And that's what caused them to do the different jobs. And some people are meant to rule over people. They're the philosopher kings, and other people are meant to be ditch diggers, and other people are meant to be soldiers, etc. And Leo Strauss says that there are some people that are just naturally superior. They're the intellectuals, the philosopher kings. And that they're meant to rule over the rest of us, and that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are an example of excessive democracy. Now, how does that make any sense, right? These are both authoritarian governments. Well, in Plato's book, The Republic, Plato argues that the ancient Greek city-states are in an eternal cycle. And that first they have a good, noble king, and that's called a monarchy. But after a few generations, the monarchy deteriorates into, you get a bad, corrupt king, an entitled, spoiled brat king, and he's called a tyrant. And so the tyrant is overthrown by the elite, and the good, noble elite who overthrow the tyrant and then take over are called the oligarchy. And so the oligarchy rules. But after a few generations, the oligarchy gets corrupt, and you get a very corrupt, self-serving elite called a plutocracy. The oligarchy becomes plutocracy. Monarchy becomes tyranny. Tyranny then leads to oligarchy. Oligarchy becomes plutocracy. And so the plutocracy is overthrown by the masses. And the masses overthrow the plutocracy, and they establish the republic, which is an elected government. But after a while, the republic becomes democracy, which is mob rule. That the republic has protections for the right of the individual and an elected government, but democracy means that no one has any freedom, that the mob of people can get together and force their will. And democracy in Plato's teaching is a very bad thing, because the ignorant, foolish people are making decisions they have no right to make, and the rights of the individual are not being protected. So Plato argues that out of democracy, you get monarchy again, that people get so tired of the mob rule that you get a good king and the cycle starts over again. And Leo Strauss interprets this to argue that Stalin and Hitler are both like a representation of democracy, that the Russian Revolution, the Nazi, the Weimar Republic, that the people were too involved in politics and they were angry. The economy was bad and the people got too involved in politics. And so they created this authoritarian system that suppressed the rights of the individual, and that America's job was to protect the rights of the individual, to make sure that the rabble never got out of control, so that the philosopher kings could naturally rise to the top and rule over us. It is blatant elitism. It's a completely different interpretation than what we're standard, told, right? But the idea was that America is a great place because the masses of people are controlled and they're not able to interfere in politics, that we're ruled over, and that our government doesn't mobilize us and get us involved, and that we're just kind of ruled over. Leo Strauss's favorite TV show was Gunsmoke. You ever watch Gunsmoke? It's an old cowboy TV show from the 1950s where the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good, and the bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad, not a single redeeming quality. And Leo Strauss says that's how Americans should come to understand politics. It should be an episode of Gunsmoke. America should be all good, and all of America's enemies should be all bad. And the smart people like him and Irving Kristol and Carl Gershman, they can understand the nuances of it. Of course, they can understand the nuances, but the common people can't understand it. So we should just have the media tell them it's an episode of Gunsmoke. What's very interesting is we've had two presidents in American history who are considered very close to the neocons, who literally wore cowboy hats and dressed as cowboys. And one of them was Ronald Reagan, who had been a cowboy actor in Hollywood, had played cowboys in cowboy movies. The other was George W. Bush. George W. Bush was born in Connecticut to New England old money, but yet, as president, he put on a cowboy hat and he said, I'm going to smoke him out. I'm going to smoke out Osama bin Laden, right? And I'm going to fight the evildoers, right? And that they dressed as cowboys, but that fits, right? They were trained. They had a bunch of neocons all around them, and those neocons were telling them it needs to be a cowboy movie, and the people voting for them were boomers, right? Cowboy movies are not a thing for my generation, right? I mean, I knew about cowboy movies. My parents talked about them. They weren't making cowboy movies when I was a kid in the 90s. I think they made like a movie Tombstone that was kind of a big hit in the 90s. That was a cowboy movie that was about the OK Corral. But cowboy movies are like a 50s and 60s thing, right? You had in the 50s and 60s, you have High Noon and The Hour of the Gun and My Darling Clementine, and even up into the 70s, right? You've got Clint Eastwood and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But by the 80s, and especially in the 90s, cowboy movies were not a thing. But you have to remember that Ronald Reagan, old people in America vote more than anybody. And back then, they weren't old people. In the 1980s, boomers who grew up watching cowboy movies in the 50s and 60s, they weren't old people back then. And even in the 2000s and the 90s, right? And so the cowboy persona, right? They're being trained by television to think of American politics like cowboys, like a cowboy movie. And, and the president takes on the persona. He's literally dressed as a cowboy. For them, that has psychological propaganda value. Nowadays, not so much. Cowboy movies are a thing of the past. But for that generation that they were trying to propagandize, the cowboy thing was a really, really important part of propaganda, right? And so having America as the good cowboy in the white hat, having the Russians as the bad cowboys in the black hat, and it has to be a shootout, that was how they trained people. It was propaganda. It was about brainwashing, right? And that if you watched cowboy movies on your TV your whole life and you didn't have a phone and you didn't have the internet and there were only 3 channels on your TV, it was a very effective way of brainwashing people and getting people to support American imperialism around the world, neoconservatism. So neoconservatism is a wing. It is a split from a split from a split. And I got to say that, I wrote my book, right, which I do recommend. If you liked this lecture, go to the link below and buy my book, Trotsky and the Neocons. Let me put the cover on the screen. I wrote the book about this. I did an interview with Kim Iverson. And no one, what I'm saying here, I didn't invent this stuff. This is all Googleable. This is all common knowledge, right? But every time I talk about this stuff, I get a layer of people who get angry with me, Trotskyists largely. And they say, no. These people were not Trotskyists. Well, they were at one time. They stopped being Trotskyists. Yes, Trotsky fought with these people in 1939. And in my book, and tonight, I spent a long time quoting what Trotsky and the Trotskyists said against these people. These people are a breakaway from Trotskyism, right? They're not representatives of what Trotsky thought. They are people that started out with Trotsky, broke with Trotsky, founded the New Left, eventually got angry at the left, and they founded neoconservatism. That's who the neocons are. But there is a trajectory that started with Trotsky. They were Trotskyists, and then they became third camp Trotskyists, and then they became new leftists, and then they became neoconservatives. What is the continuity? What is the continuity? There is a thread of continuity, and that continuity is anti-populism. And I reference, whenever I talk about Trotsky, I reference this book that Trotsky wrote, Stalin, An Appraisal of the Man and His Influence by Leon Trotsky. I will point you to page 1 of the book. Page 1 of the book. Page 1 of chapter 1. The late Leonid Krasin, the old revolutionist, eminent engineer, and brilliant Soviet diplomat, intelligent human being, was the first to call Stalin Asiatic. In saying that, he had in mind no problematic racial attributes, but rather the blending of grit, shrewdness, craftiness, and cruelty, which had been considered characteristic of the statesmen of Asia. Bukharin subsequently simplified the appellation, calling Stalin Genghis Khan, manifestly in order to draw attention to his cruelty, which had developed into brutality. He spends the first pages of this book talking about how Stalin's not a white man. Even though Stalin looks like a white man, even though Stalin, he's Asiatic. He's not good and European and civilized. He's a Mongoloid. Stalin is like Genghis Khan. He is Eastern, not Western. Trotsky thought the West was the best. And that's what neocons think too. Trotsky said, New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind would be forged. And after the Russian Revolution, he did not want the Soviet Union to build socialism in one country. He wanted to spread communism to the West, where it really mattered. And he considered the East to be backward and primitive. And he saw Stalin as a representation of Eastern backwardness and primitivism. And he saw the peasantry of Russia as backward and primitive. And he, like Leo Strauss, he hated ordinary people. And he didn't like the idea of excessive democracy. As much as he talked about proletarian democracy, he really didn't like especially the Russian peasantry. And he thought he was better and superior. And he had a fear of the masses of people. And he saw Stalin's rise to power as the rabble, the ordinary people asserting their will. And that's dangerous. And the neocons shared that. They didn't like Stalin. They didn't like Roosevelt. And they certainly did not like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And later, they had the New Left that was about fearing populism and fearing mass movements. And eventually, when the New Left was associated with people in the East rising up and asserting their rights, and the Vietnamese and all of that, they broke with the New Left. There is a continuity. It is anti-populism and elitism of the intellectuals that is the trajectory between from Trotsky to neoconservatism. They're not the same ideology, right? And I've never said that Trotskyism and neoconservatism are the same. I've never said that. All that I have pointed out is that there is a natural trajectory that these people went on. There's a journey that these people went on, and they represent a strata. And this is another controversial thing I point out. You cannot separate this from Zionism. Zionism. That Trotsky aligned himself in 1912 with the Jewish Bund of Russia. Lenin denounced the Jewish Bund, a group of communists in Russia who said we have to form our own separate communist party for Jews only because Jews are just so different and so special. We have to form our own group. And Lenin, who was also Jewish, said, no. That is the spirit of the ghetto. This idea that Jews should be separate from the rest of the working class in Europe, that is reactionary. And then the most blatant expression of it is Zionism. But Bundism, the Jewish Bund, is another expression of this. And this is the spirit of the ghetto, cultivating a spirit of separation. And really what it is Jewish supremacism, right? And that Trotsky had been persecuted because of his Jewish faith, and there were horrendous pogroms in Tsarist Russia where Jews had their villages burned, etc. And that Trotsky's hatred for the Russian peasantry and his anti-populism was rooted in the fact that he was in a religious ethnic group that was separated and isolated from Russian society. And his worship of the West and his contempt for Russia was based on that. And the contempt for the masses of people that you see the new left have, and later you see an expression, the neocons and the Zionists, there is an ethnic component to it, right? It flows from the experience of a group of people that have been subjected to a huge amount of persecution, and that the Jewish supremacist narrative that defines Zionism. Zionism is the idea that Jews are so special and so different, they have to have their own country. They can't assimilate into Europe. They have to have their own country, and that in order to have their own country, it's okay for them to murder the Palestinians, and that, and that it's okay because it's just about them, and that, that Zionist ideology, it flows from centuries of persecution, and that Trotskyism has a shade of that as well. And that neoconservatism took that spirit of anti-populism and that contempt, seeing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as the same system, right? It's just an expression of vulgar mob rule in the masses of people, seeing themselves as superior, right? Leo Strauss thought he was a philosopher king. He was better than everybody else, meant to rule over the others, right? That there is a component to this. Now, a lot of people will tell you all the neocons were Jews. That is not true. Dwight McDonald was not a Jew, right? John Bolton is not a Jew. Marco Rubio is not a Jew, right? And that it's not a Jewish conspiracy. This is simply an intellectual, it's a way of seeing things that developed. And largely, a lot of the neocon thinkers in the Trump administration or in our contemporary time, a lot of them are people that were trained by Leo Strauss, trained by Irving Kristol, etc., but they are not of the Jewish background. A lot of them are guys that were in the U.S. military, and they were high-achieving guys in the military who were successful and went back to college and got their PhDs in foreign policy, and then they were trained by Leo Strauss, but they have their own view, and that's John Bolton's background. That's Mike Pompeo, right? I think he was a military guy who, so please, we're not saying anything anti-Semitic here. And that the problem, it's been said that anti-Semitism is socialism for fools. The problem with it is that anti-Semitism is very, very primitive. This Nick Fuentes stuff, it just makes it all out like, there's just one group of people and they're bad. Well, not only is that bigoted and racist, that's also ignorant, right? It's more complicated than that. I just spent almost 2 hours explaining to you this complicated history, and there's certain people that don't want to learn any of that. They just want to learn Jews are bad, and that's not what we're saying here, right? We're not saying that, right? And that there were many Jewish folks who were loyal to Stalin, right? There were many Jewish folks who didn't become Trotskyists, who defended the Soviet Union until the end, right? And there were many Jewish folks who didn't go along with a lot of this. So it's not, please do not interpret what I am saying as some kind of anti-Semitic tirade. We're not blaming anyone on the basis of their race, and we're certainly not saying there's a big racial conspiracy. We're pointing out that there is an intellectual trajectory. This is where neoconservatism comes from. If you want to read my book, I wrote a good book about this, where it come from. But this slideshow that I'm doing is about this history because I want people to know this history. This is an important part of CPI and our understanding. We understand the trajectory from Trotskyism to neoconservatism, and also that woke leftism is also very anti-populist as well, right? The modern left is very, very anti-populist. So if you want to read the book, I recommend my own book. I'm proud of my book. It's a good book. So there you go. That's the book. It's in the chat. But yeah, that's tonight's presentation. Where did the neocons come from? So I hope you enjoyed that.